Hey, hi, friars. Yeah, it's ranting time. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've seen a lot of red in my portfolio this week. Yeah, it's been quite brutal. And I don't even have such high exposure to all this DeFi food coins that are out there. Yeah, the majority of my bags are pretty much Ethereum. Had a decent amount of Tezos. Luckily, been able to sell into that upwards wave. Um, anyway, yeah, but just some thoughts on just on the nature of the market and now seeing something that obviously happened in 2017 play out much faster in 2020, and that's just this whole cycle of just like some parasitic involvement from individuals. I'm a pretty free market guy. I'm all for caveat emptor. If you get into a thing, you're an adult most likely. If you are an adult, if you're not an adult, don't just get into random situations. But if you are an adult, you know, take responsibility for yourself. Understand what you're getting into. Understand who or what you're investing in. In the crypto space, understand if it's a classical business or if it's a legit utility token or if it's a legit DAO, like what we're trying to build. But kind of like be careful, and understand what you're getting into because, I mean, in the 2017 cycle, we obviously had a lot of parasitic involvement, and the parasitic involvement and the parasitic cycle is starting to become clear to me now how it works and how it actually impedes a lot of innovation in the space. Now, the thing is, crypto is starting to become more regulated. I'm not really a fan of those regulations. I think, unfortunately, they sometimes stifle the rapid rate of iteration. But I can understand, at least to a degree, why those regulations exist. Yeah, and essentially what happened in 2017 was obviously people discovered the power of an ERC20 based ICO. So a heck of a lot of people started launching up ICOs, and essentially selling some future infrastructure, Ethereum killer. Those were the majority of the projects, and one or two. When I say one or two, I mean just a much smaller percentage. There were obviously hundreds of these as well. Other interesting protocol level projects. Now, 99% of that stuff plus was terrible, was absolutely terrible. And I'd say, I don't know what the split was between flat out dishonesty, self deceived dishonesty, and just an inability to execute. It's very hard to say, but I'd say easily 99% of those ICOs never stood a chance. So the result in capital flow back then was essentially that a lot of new money went into Ether because Ether was the commodity that was essentially used. This was before we really had DAI or USDC or anything to that effect at the scale we have now. So people used Ether to actually buy into these things. So that created an interesting dynamic where basically people wanted the upside of investing in their ICO. But the result was there was a massive supply squeeze for Ether because Ether was the only way that you could participate in this thing, right? So Ether massively pulled this rally. There was sort of a Bitcoin rally for the first part of 2017, and then Ether just freaking pulled that thing all the way to the ludicrously high heights that we saw. Um, in retrospect, this is always much easier to understand after it's done than while it's happening. But in retrospect, obviously, what happened there was that eventually, we several things happened. The first thing is those projects did not mature, right? So even the good ones took a long time before they actually started, before they would actually start throwing off revenue. Now, to my knowledge, there's like I don't know. There are very few of those ICOs who have actually like made any money back at all, right? That aren't just still speculative plays on maybe they get something right in the future. Yeah, so very few of those projects even had the chance to really get to that point. And then obviously the rest of the parasitic behavior was that if you had a smart ICO operator, he basically took his ICO money and he immediately put it in to stable coins or actual dollars in a bank account somewhere so that he could go build his project, right? A very, very good ICO, which also, hasn't given Ethereum returns yet, but in my opinion is arguably one of the best teams in crypto, has been Augur. And Augur raised quite a lot of Ether. If they'd kept it, they would have, I don't know, they might have crossed $1 billion, but they basically sold it all into about $5 million. But that $5 million was more than sufficient for them to deliver the product and to actually then continue to deliver the project. And their own internal treasuries, obviously shot up quite a bit. But that was a good project, and that thing took years. It finally went live in 2018, and version 2 is now finally live. That's far more usable. And obviously they need to keep improving it to keep ahead of the gas requirements and to keep the UX good and that kind of stuff. But anyway, back to my original point. So the idea is that all of this money flooded into these ICOs, and if the ICO was smart, they cashed out, which almost none of them did, because very few of them were smart. And if they weren't smart, they kept the they kept the Ether. Then as they had to actually start building this stuff, obviously they had to sell the Ether. And this was after we had run out of buyers for this whole scheme. And then the whole thing basically started trickling down again. And this is where the parasitic aspect came in. Even if we assume that the majority of these tokens were well intended, which I think is a very, very dubious assumption, but if we assume that, basically, they still couldn't really execute. So these were people who'd never built businesses before. They've never had to budget. They've never had to do anything, on that scale. Now suddenly you give them millions of dollars and a big technical problem to solve, right? What's going to happen? They're going to misspend that money. That money is going to attract sharks, and the sharks are basically going to eat it all up, and they are going to go to every second conference, and they are going to live La Vida Crypto, right? So that was the parasitic cycle back then. Currently, the parasitic cycle, and I think I should make a video just where I just say this about DeFi. The parasitic cycle is very straightforward. The parasitic cycle is essentially, we are building the same product as Uniswap, right? Or some variant of it. Right, and if you give us liquidity for pool 1, which is typically 2 risk-free coins, which is like USDC and DAI. If you give us those, and we'll give you some of our governance token, right, for our clone of a thing that already exists. Then we give you pool 2, and pool 2 is where we really we just latch on and we suck the life out of you. Pool 2 is essentially where it's your coin, where it's the project's governance coin, in no safe proportion, like typically 50 or maybe even higher than that, and then some Ether. And then essentially what starts happening is we start dumping into you, right? Or the people who are early, they start dumping into you. And the problem is it's not that those people are, selling their tokens, so that they can buy back later because they're really long the project. It's not some, possibly benevolent use like that. It's just they're just selling into it, and that's it. Now they no longer have the bags. They no longer have any sort of a real long-term interest in sticking around. They've just essentially extracted capital out of the system, and they've left people with otherwise useless tokens who can't really coordinate to move things forward. Right. So that's essentially the parasitic cycle. It's legitimate pool followed by illegitimate pool, which is mainly the intention is to take your money. That if you provide that liquidity, that they actually grab that liquidity back from you, right? So I think Andre over at Yearn Finance probably constructed one of the better pool 2s, and that's something that we might follow, but we'll also, we'll caveat it as this is quite risky and this is what might happen. But essentially what he did was he built a pool, the Yearn community. I'm not sure if he was wholly responsible for it, but the Yearn community built a balancer pool that was 98% DAI and 2% Wi-Fi token. So that massively protects people against impermanent losses, and if the supply of the token is not incredibly dubious and it can't be printed out of nothing by one individual, then that's probably also a pretty safe bet, and a nice way to provide liquidity for the governance token and then possibly earn some of the governance token back. But yeah, guys, be careful for the parasites. Really, just throwing money at stuff randomly. We see it in our Telegram group the whole time. There's some measure of interest. It gathers a whole life of itself. It enormously spikes momentarily, and then people with other tokens obviously like sell back into that, and it takes quite a while for anyone to really like recover if they bought completely into that spike. Yeah, I mean, luckily our sale is constructed such that if you understand what you're doing, you can get a pretty fair price over time. So please go do your own research. Please be careful of the rest of this stuff. I honestly think that crypto and Ethereum specifically is utterly freaking life changing, and that there's like a handful of projects that you should buy and forget that you have them. You just hold them until capital gains becomes of interest to you, and then you should experiment. You should experiment with all the stuff out there. You should just see how things work. You should give everyone a fair shake. Also, none of this is to say that you should be paranoid. I don't think you should be paranoid. Let's just let this truck pass. I don't think you should be paranoid. I just basically think, you should be critical. You should be very, very critical, and you should be super critical if you're giving your money to someone else, even if you're using it for staking. Because the problem is basically with the staking schemes, if it's not a risk-free pool, like basically two well-established coins or two stable coins, then essentially that means there's a very good chance that somebody's going to dump into that liquidity of yours. And if you don't know if this team is going to dump into your liquidity, if that's what you provide, then make the assumption that that is definitely what's going to happen.